Hello and welcome to the Imaging Wire Show. My name is Brian Casey and I'm managing editor of the Imaging Wire. We've got a great episode for you today. Our topic is a comprehensive approach to Theranostics, and we'll be learning all about this exciting new discipline. Our guests are Shari Manuel. She is Vice President and General Manager of Molecular Imaging, Chris Heble, Senior Director, Molecular Imaging Strategy, and Elfareato Remekie, Vice President of Oncology. Everyone is with the USA and Canada region at GE Healthcare. Thanks everyone for being with us today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much, Brian.
All right, I'd like to start with introductions. Shari, can you let us know a little bit about yourself and your role at GE Healthcare?
Sure, thanks, Brian. So I lead the cross-functional organization leading the cyclotron radiopharmaceutical business, as well as the PET-CT and nuclear medicine portfolio across all of our modalities. And I also lead the sales organization across the US and Canada.
Great. Chris, how about you?
Yeah, so I work for Shari as the Senior Director for Molecular Imaging Strategy. Been with GE Healthcare about 25 years in a number of different roles. So I specifically have responsibility for the US and Canada's product management within our PET and SPECT and radiopharmacy portfolios, as well as the marketing and learning development for our sales employees.
Great. And E, how about you?
Yeah, my name is Elfareato Remekie, otherwise known as E. And as outlined, I'm the Vice President of Oncology for US and Canada. And as you think about GE being a standalone health system, oncology and cardiology are two key strategic initiatives. And I lead the oncology portfolio for US and Canada.
Great, excellent. So let's dive into it. Now, most of our viewers have probably heard of Theranostics, but let's dive in and define exactly what this is. Chris, can you start for us?
Sure. So Theranostics is a combination of two different words, right? Therapeutics and diagnostics. So Theranostics. One of them is a radioactive drug that's used to diagnose disease, specifically cancer in most circumstances. A second radioactive drug, again, is then used for treatment. Both of those actually target the same receptors on the cells. So it is a very specific and very targeted therapy. The radionuclides themselves for both diagnosis and treatment are different because one is emitting gamma radiation that we can see with molecular imaging equipment. The other one, of course, is going to the cancer cell to destroy it. So it's either emitting beta radiation or alpha radiation, depending upon the radionuclide in question.
And so the power of these payloads is probably going to be pretty different, right? I mean, you're not going to need a radiation payload with a diagnostic radiopharmaceutical as you would with a therapeutic, correct?
Certainly not a destructive payload. That's absolutely right. Yeah, that's something we absolutely try to avoid and want to go by the ALARA principle as low as reasonably acceptable from a dose perspective on those diagnostic agents themselves.
Okay. And how common is it right now? Are a lot of sites doing this, or is this still something that's just getting started?
So Theranostics itself has actually been around since the 1940s. The first initial use was with artificially produced iodine-131, radioactive iodine-131. A brilliant gentleman named Saul Hertz saw the potential for it, used it as a therapy for patients with thyroid cancer. So in and of itself, the concept has been around for decades, right? We've seen some significant introductions in the marketplace, I'm sure we'll talk about, that have evolved this therapeutic care pathway towards other disease states like prostate cancer and neuroendocrine tumors.
Now, E, can you talk to us a little bit about what are some of the advantages of Theranostics? And I've heard it described as like a type of precision medicine. What makes it more precise than other forms of cancer therapy?
Yeah, Theranostics by definition is precision medicine, right? It, as Chris just outlined, it uses specific targeting compounds for both imaging and therapy of a particular malignancy, right? Its ability to really identify areas of the disease that are more likely to respond to targeted therapies is invaluable to cancer patients. And further to that, clinicians are not only praising its success, but also its potential to help them be more prescriptive in effectively navigating the disease management by aligning said patients with the treatments that will be most impactful to them.
So, Chris, what are some of the recent technological advances that have made Theranostics possible?
Oh, great question. So, Brian, in 2015, we saw the introduction of Xofigo or radium-223 to the marketplace. That's an alpha emitter. It was specifically targeted towards prostate cancer metastasis in the bone. In 2018, we saw the introduction of another therapeutic radiopharmaceutical and its diagnostic counterparts. That would be Lutathera for neuroendocrine tumors. And then in 2021, we saw the introduction of a big hitter, Pluvicto or lutetium-177 PSMA, prostate-specific membrane antigen, that targets all of prostate cancer, primary and metastatic disease. And that's just on the radiopharmaceutical side. There have been significant advancements in the imaging technology aspect of this as well, and how we image those therapies post-therapy. Of course, the diagnostic agents that go into imaging the patients on the PET-CT for the initial diagnosis of that metastatic disease, and those compounds in addition.
So basically, cancers are emitting PSMA, for example, and that's what some of these compounds are homing in on?
They don't necessarily emit PSMA, but the cellular structure itself has a prostate-specific membrane antigen on the outside of the cell. So because we have that tag on the radiopharmaceutical and on the radiodiagnostic as well, it goes specifically to that receptor on the cell.
And so that would be the precision part, because you're just going right
Absolutely.
to the cancer. Now, Eve, what are some of the benefits that Theranostics offer over traditional technologies?
Yeah, when you think about, the advances in treating prostate cancer, an example, certain prostate cancer types called castrate or hormone resistant continues to grow. Theranostics offers an ability for a centered approach around treating these more lethal castrate-resistant prostate cancer by combining a targeting compound or ligand with a radioactive particle, which is injected into the patients and targets the cancer cell. So it's a more targeted approach where other therapeutics have failed in the past.
Now, Shari, can you talk a little bit about the role of imaging technology in Theranostics? We've talked a lot about the therapeutic agents. What role does imaging play in directing therapy and monitoring treatment?
Sure. So imaging, while it's not the only part of having a successful Theranostics program and supporting that patient through the care pathway, it is a critical piece. And so throughout the past 5 to 7 years, we've really seen where Theranostics could take molecular imaging and, again, the oncology care pathway toward precision medicine. So the focus and development around our imaging technologies has been very deliberately focused within the digital space and focused on how we can design imaging technology to align with what's needed in the Theranostics space. And so we've split up and looked at our total molecular imaging solutions within discovery, diagnosis, and treatment, as you see the patient going through the care pathway. From a discovery standpoint, the radiopharmaceutical, the radiodiagnostic development and manufacturing is through our cyclotron business, and then taking that with our fast cells. Moving into the imaging piece around diagnosis, that patient will have a PET-CT scan, and really the development and design of that technology to be an ultra high sensitivity system so that the imaging is not only fast, because we're going to see just a tremendous influx of patients come through the health system, but also being able to see disease early and see it small in its infancy so that that patient has a better survival rate. From there, you're able to then utilize that PET-CT for staging. And then as the patient moves through their treatment and therapy process, then they would be imaged post-therapy with SPECT-CT. And again, the focus on digital technology with fast scans and very sensitive and high resolution imaging for quantitative accuracy is critical.
Now, what the difference between PET-CT and SPECT-CT, what do those two technologies offer that give them both roles in this?
So the ability on the front end where FDG tags to the cancer cells to be used for that diagnosis and that staging. And then from a nuclear medicine standpoint, being able to use that radiotherapeutic and radionuclide to really image and see post-therapeutic imaging of what is happening to the critical organs. Is that therapy is that patient responding to that therapy? So being able to utilize that SPECT-CT technology in post-therapeutic imaging is where that SPECT-CT technology plays a role.
Great. Now, Chris, could you talk a little bit about how patients are typically selected for Theranostics? Who would be good candidates for this?
Well, today, so the indications for Pluvicto, the prostate cancer therapeutic, and for Lutathera, the neuroendocrine tumor therapeutic, are all for metastatic disease. So as E said before, sometimes hormone therapy in prostate cancer, as a specific example, is not effective. Sometimes external beam radiation is not effective. Sometimes taxane-based chemotherapy is effective, but then there's recurrence, right? And the patient still has metastatic disease. They have they go into for their follow-up post some other type of therapy, and they still have a rising PSA, which is the blood test that's looking for that for that prostate cancer reoccurrence in the patient. And those patients that see that rise in the PSA would then be the one that's referred by their oncologist to the nuclear medicine department for one of those gallium-68 PSMA studies or F-18 Pylarify studies on the PET-CT that Shari described.
And what's the workflow like for a typical case?
Yeah, so once they get that initial diagnostic scan, it's going to be typically read by a nuclear physician or a radiologist with special training in nuclear medicine. Then it goes to, that report goes back to the oncologist for the purposes of determining whether or not the metastatic disease is present. If it is, then the patient is then usually referred to this new theranostic care pathway by a multidisciplinary team. So usually nuclear medicine physicians, radiologists working in combination with medical oncologists and a radiation oncologist, and sometimes urologist in the case of prostate cancer, to determine what the next best thing to do in this patient's course of therapy is. If they are then chosen to go through a theranostic care pathway or Pluvicto, they can receive anywhere from 2 to 6 doses of Pluvicto over roughly a 2 to 6 month period, roughly 4 weeks in between each one. That being said, you can also image that SPECT-CT that Shari talked about after each one of those therapies and look at the gamma radiation that's coming off the patient at the same time they're being treated by the beta radiation that was injected to them as well. So that's the beauty of therapeutics, is you're actually seeing what you're treating, right, when you're looking at that post-therapy. And then, of course, you do the quantification, find out that certainly the critical organs are maintaining the appropriate level of function, how much dose is being received, how much dose is going to specific tumors, and whether or not potentially down the road, you may want to look at personalizing the dose for those particular patients moving forward.
And that was where the precision medicine comes in. And so it sounds like prostate's a big clinical application. Any other applications that are really kind of rising with Theranostics?
There's a lot in development. So there's probably somewhere between 60 to 65 clinical trials that are going on right now. They're anywhere between phase 1 and phase 3. Breast is going to be a significant entrant into the market sometime in the near future. Melanoma, of course, is a specific target as well. And those may actually use different diagnostic and therapeutic compounds, of course, than what we've talked about before, and different diagnostic and therapeutic radioisotopes as well. We'll see copper-64 emerge more as a diagnostic agent, copper-67 as a therapeutic. Same thing for lead-203 and lead-212, respectively.
If I could just add as well, as Chris had mentioned, just the amount of phase 1 clinical trials, but also just over 100 companies that are not generating any revenue today and that are backed by venture capital money that are really searching for the next big radiotherapeutic. So it's that part of it is just a sheer investment in what everyone sees as the promise and the future growth of Theranostics.
So we should see a lot of exciting new compounds coming out. So Shari, it sounds like Theranostics is a great option for the right patient. Why is starting a Theranostic service a good idea for a hospital?
Yeah, so throughout our visits last year, met with over 80 to 90 different healthcare institutions and cancer centers. And really building a foundation of a Theranostics program is critical today, as I had mentioned, for the influx of patients that will be able to be treated with these future therapeutics. And the patients are already coming in, right? So right now with Pluvicto, it's approved for castrate-resistant prostate cancer. And so they're late stage patients and late stage disease. As we see the clinical trials moving that potential further up in that patient's care pathway, the ability for hospitals and health systems to offer this option for their patients and to have a solid Theranostics program built to be able to scale in the future, it's a discussion that is on the top of so many minds today. And that's where we're engaging and having those discussions around what is the programmatic approach and how do we build that program and that playbook for the future.
It sounds like this is, a pretty complex technology. Can you address some of the challenges that a hospital might encounter in implementing a Theranostics program?
Yeah, and the key word there is program, right? We speak about Theranostics on the component of imaging and therapeutics, but it's really much, much more than that. And as you're planning out how you design a facility around Theranostics, there's a lot of strategy that goes into that aspect. You look at maybe educational piece, right? There's a huge component where you have to really train all of the people that are involved in that process on what Theranostics is. I mean, we visited, as Shari outlined, 80 or so different clients, and they're at varying stages. And for the most part, everyone viewed Theranostics differently. And then you were talking about access to the radiopharmaceuticals as well as on-time and reliable supply, right? These are big challenges that you have to factor in, especially we outlined that these are very sick late stage patients that in some cases can't even show up to their appointment. So if you have a scheduled treatment plan on a Friday evening, as an example, and one patient is not able to show up for that treatment, how do you bring another patient into the fold to take access of these very expensive therapeutics? And then how do you create that ecosystem that really follows the patient throughout that process? Speak about precision imaging, personalized dosimetry, but how do you monitor the patient outside the four walls of the hospitals and feed that data back into the process? These are some of the areas that we've been seeing in the market that are really proven to be challenging as you design what we call a Theranostic Center of Excellence for the future.
Yeah. Now, a lot of these radiopharmaceuticals are pretty novel. Some of them have just come on the market. Is it challenging to handle these?
I'll take that one. So the nuclear medicine technologists and nuclear medicine physicians that are typically sometimes the radiation safety officers all have training on how to handle these radiopharmaceuticals, Brian. That isn't specifically a challenge. What does become a challenge sometimes is the levels of radioactivity that are being used. And since Pluvicto, for example, and Lutathera are actually collected in the renal system and then excreted through the urine, there's something that needs to be done with all that radioactive waste, right? So that has to be taken into consideration as well. And that's something that the facility actually has to manage as part of this process.
I never would have thought of that. So what are some of the ways that GE can help hospitals and health systems that want to set up a Theranostics program?
Yeah, and it goes back to that programmatic approach that we spoke about in the onset, right? We have this advisory team that can really sit and assess based on lessons learned that we've had visiting over 80 plus clients as to establishing where you are. What's your fundamental understanding of Theranostics? How are you looking 5 to 10 years out in terms of developing that program? So we sort of triage this into 3 segments, right? It's the foundational aspects of the program. Where are you today, right? Then from a transformational perspective, where do you see Theranostics tomorrow? Are you built to sustain these explosive growth of therapeutics? And then as these therapies become first-line treatments, how are you prepared to manage the influx of patient? And then aspirational, where do you see your practice as it correlates to Theranostics in the next 10 years and beyond? Shari and Chris outlined in the onset about all of these therapeutics that are in early stage or late stage clinical trials. So there's going to be an explosion of therapies in the market. We can really sit with you and map out each phases to get you directionally to where you need to be considered what we call a center of excellence around theranostics.
I think another piece too, as E had mentioned, the different stages and where is that customer today, the overall big feedback we heard is just around the sheer amount of data and patient information that resides in so many different areas and so many different portals within the hospital. So how can we as a vendor partner help to enable and create solutions that will enable then the future growth of Theranostics as it relates to the digital infrastructure that is needed for that growth of the patient data that's out there?
Yeah, and you just triggered a thought, Shari, around isotope development. When you look at, the imaging component of imaging these patients and the speed that you need to do from a dosimetry perspective, right? And when do you introduce spec? And as well as digital tools that can enable patient management. These are all areas that we're actively investing in now at various stages, somewhere in the early stages, somewhere in the late stages. And we feel we're really positioned appropriately to support a lot of these health systems take on Theranostics.
E, one of the things that you mentioned, I think that's really, really important is that scalability factor, right? So there are a lot of customers out there in the marketplace that are going to start small, right? They're only going to be doing 5 or 6 therapies a week. Now, that may not require an incredibly high productivity PET-CT scanner, but what we can do is we can help a customer invest in a platform that's going to enable them to grow over the next 10 to 15 years and provide that type of scalability from a patient throughput perspective. And the same thing is plausible on the SPEC CT for the post-therapy imaging, as well as if a customer wants to get into their own operation for radiodiagnostic pharmaceutical production with cyclotrons and the capability to use liquid target to produce gallium at a larger scale, and then solid target for an even larger scale at that. I mean, that gives them the capability to produce 100 times the amount of gallium in a single run that they can get off a generator in a day. So it's truly about the ability to scale this going forward. And I think that that leads us down the pathway of how can it be economically practical to invest in this type of care pathway.
Great. Well, this is all really exciting. It's gonna be fascinating to see where the field of theranostics goes in the near future. So thanks so much. Any parting words from today's discussion?
Yeah, Brian, thanks. I'll take it. So on behalf of Shari and E and myself, thanks so much to the Imaging Wire for having us on this interview. It's been a pleasure to talk about Theranostics. This is absolutely a care pathway that we know is exploding in the near future. It is absolutely going to be a hockey stick of growth in the neighborhood of $30 billion worth of growth over the next several years. So again, that scale is important. Having a programmatic solution to how you implement a Theranostics program is important. And we do believe that there's the opportunity to help customers grow and expand and meet the demand that's going to be there for this in the future. It is the future of personalized healthcare.
Yeah, and it is really exciting to see. So thanks everyone so much for being with us today. Chris, Ian, and Shari, signing off for the Imaging Wire. My name is Brian Casey.